Over the last century or two, Africa, the so-called dark continent, has attracted explorers, exploiters, and colonizers. In 2008, humanist, poet, and a distinguished travel writer, Geddes, was compelled to experience Africa, its most volatile regions, to interview former child soldiers, activists, genocide survivors, rebels, and revolutionaries. A mind-boggling adventure indeed. It is my pleasure to welcome Geddes, one of Canada's most celebrated writers, to Studio 4 to tell us more. Nice to see you again.
It's great to be here, Fanny.
What led you on this journey? Who led you on this journey, more importantly?
Yeah, I think my family thinks I was led astray, whoever it was. I went out of curiosity, but mainly out of shame at being ignorant for so long about what was happening in Africa.
Why Africa?
It's the only continent I hadn't really visited, and I was, you wonder why after a lifetime you've ignored this amazing continent with so much happening, so many cultures. Congo alone has 180 languages. So I wondered if somehow my fear of Africa had something to do with a kind of unconscious racism, and so I thought I'd better challenge that at my advanced stage of decrepitude.
And cruelty and inhumanity, and sights that most of us will never see, truly.
Yeah, sights that most people don't want to see. It was certainly not a Cook's tour for me. I wasn't one of those people that P.K. Page talks about, the lonely tourists with their empty eyes longing to be filled with monuments. There were moments, I should say, though, when I'd like to have seen the odd monument instead of what I was listening to.
Who did you call for advice before you departed?
Well, I called Jonathan Manthorpe at the Vancouver Sun, and he gave me some good advice, which basically boiled down to watch your ass. And it was something I kept in mind much of the time I was there.
And I think he said, too, there's so much he'd like to forget about Africa, so much he embraces, but so much he'd like to forget.
Well, also, I mean, he did say that there was a lot of joy in Africa, and I was hoping I'd capture not only some of the pain, but some of the joy.
Where did you start?
I went to Rwanda. I interviewed women who were raped and infected with HIV, and I talked to people at the Village of Hope. It's an amazing little place with women working as weavers there, and the difficulty for me was figuring out how I would get them to trust me, this gangly white man with camera and notebook. Why should they tell me their stories when they could hardly tell them to their own family?
And how did you do that?
Well, I left with a line of Jean Vanier's in my mind, George Vanier, who had done the L'Arche communities, working with the emotionally, mentally disadvantaged. He said, we live in a world of power and strength and invulnerability, and these things make us hard. And he said, well, but it's vulnerability that brings us together. And so I decided I needed to talk to people, as the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu said, speak to each other to the wound in each other, which meant acknowledging that there was a wound in me. And so I had to start by opening up about my own family background, my own inadequacies. And to my great surprise and relief, the women just opened up and started to tell me their stories.
And their stories were some heartening and many just unbelievable. I recall from Drink the Bitter Root the story of Nancy in the Congo.
Nancy's in Uganda, and she was attacked by the Lord's Resistance Army, this group of rebels run by Joseph Kony, a kind of psychopathic figure. And they killed all of her friends, but because Nancy was pregnant, they left her with by just removing her nose, ears, and lips. This was a consolation for being pregnant. And it was a horrific story, and as I listened to her tell me this story, I could feel the rage building up in myself. And I was thinking, Kony, a bullet is too good for you. You need to suffer slowly. So I asked Nancy, what do you think should happen to these people that have done these things to you? And without batting an eyelash, she said they should be restored to the community, They were mostly abducted boys. And this was such a shock to hear this graceful forgiveness. And I'm the mere observer listening and thinking revenge and retribution, but she, the victim, was counseling forgiveness and restoration.
As you looked at her, she's had some restorative surgery, but not all.
She had one upper lip was being restored. And she saw how, it wasn't just the pain of that story and the grace of her forgiveness. It was the fact that she had enough imagination to see what was happening to me. I was a mess listening to this story, so she said, Gary, your name in the Acholi language sounds like the word for bicycle. I said, Nancy, I'm so glad to hear that, because in Japanese, my name sounds like the word for diarrhea.
So bicycle is better.
Yeah.
So in all of that horrific mess is some humor, somehow. It's really uncanny, isn't it?
There were a lot of moments of humor too, including the little boy Hossein, who I met in Ethiopia, a Somali refugee whose parents had been murdered, and at age 10, he'd sewn some money into his underwear and gone to Ethiopia. He had no papers, nothing, and he was living on the streets begging. And so he insisted on being interviewed. And so I said, what do you want to do when you grow up? He said, I want to become the king of Sweden.
Well, what are the chances of that?
Yeah.
But as Nancy pointed out in the Ugandan thing, post Idi Amin, of course, but they kill us for their sport. They kill us for their sport.
Yes, the psychology of the Lord's Resistance Army is pretty hard for anybody to understand. Kony talks about establishing a country based on the 10 Commandments in Uganda, but he's willing to abduct, rape, mutilate, and murder and displace millions to do that.
What's happening to women in the Congo?
It's considered the worst place in the world to be a woman. The rape statistics are so staggering, and civil society is working very hard to try to correct this, and organizations, NGOs are springing up everywhere to try to deal with this, to deal with the results of it, but not the causes. The causes are really what Conrad described years ago as the scramble for loot. And during the Belgian period is still going on. All these foreign companies, including Canadian companies, that are really operating with impunity in Congo and stirring up local tribal hatreds and using the ethnic card to destabilize so that they can exploit the materials.
So greed.
Greed.
Really.
Greed.
Western aid and NGOs. Someone once said Western aid could kill more people than it can help if it's used as a political tool. When it's used as a political tool.
You're right, it certainly is a political tool, but bilateral aid is quite different from the kind of small NGO aid. Bilateral aid involves a US or Italian company giving huge amounts of money to an African country for some mega project. It pleases the people in power, but none of it ever gets down, and they don't hire a Congolese person as an engineer, no laborers, and so on. And so all the money goes back to the US. 90% of the millions goes back to the US and to Italy.
And in the case of Rwanda, where post-Romeo Dallaire and the fact that no one paid much attention to the genocide, it seems to me that Rwanda would get more, I don't know if this is true, but would Rwanda get almost guilt money as opposed to another part of Africa?
Yes,
or
Rwanda has no big resources at the moment, and so it's got to be guilt money for us neglecting to do something about the genocide.
Mm-hmm. So back to Uganda for a minute. You met a couple in Uganda, Kathy and William Pike and Kathy Watson.
Yes.
Who have she's an Australian, he's English.
He was born in Africa, educated in England.
Okay, and what are they doing over there, and are they helping? And What's the drill?
Yeah, they're an amazing couple. He's a newspaper man, and she was trained as a nurse, but she became, when they moved to Africa together, she became very involved in politics and worked as a journalist. The two of them have had an amazing history. They've been there right from the time that Museveni was in the bush trying to take over the government to throw out the existing dictator. And they've really been a good example of foreigners working, giving their lives to the country and working at the grass level. She's now planting trees all over Uganda. She's got an organization for sex education, which in a fairly fundamentalist Christian country is a controversial thing to be doing.
I'm sure. But as you look at what is going on in high places at the United Nations, UNICEF, The Hague, everybody seems concerned. But what aren't they doing? What aren't we doing?
Well, I think we haven't been listening to Africans. That's the one thing one of the things I came away with. African civil society is ready to do things. There's a huge desire to get on with things. But we haven't been listening to the kinds of projects that they need and that they can handle.
Like?
Well, microcredit would be much more useful than bilateral aid. It would get to the individual people, and we know from the history of microcredit so far that when you give the women the money in the family, something happens. They pay back the debt, and it can be passed on to somebody else.
So you make them entrepreneurs in a sense, and you allow them to weave baskets, or? Yes,
and build up the educational facilities that are available to people. If we lend money and turn countries into vassals and make them so debt-ridden that they're totally exploitable, what happens? We insist on structural adjustment programs, no more free education, no more free health care, and no more control of foreign resources. So these countries are eternally subjected to our demands. So we need to find ways to get support and aid into these countries other than through the World Bank and the IMF.
Yes, and examining colonialism as it was. And one person said to you when the Belgians left the Congo, he said something like, "We're no longer your monkeys."
Yes, Patrice Lumumba, the great liberator, he surprised the Belgians by telling them the truth, and with the result that the Belgians and the CIA had him executed within a year.
Dangerous.
Dangerous.
Yes. Gary Geddes, our guest. Drink the Bitter Root, a writer's search for justice and redemption in Africa. We'll come back.